Hello and welcome to the Sex Within Marriage podcast. I'm JD, marriage educator, coach, writer, and podcaster. And at uncoveringintimacy.com, we offer a wide range of resources to help couples strengthen intimacy in all areas of their marriage. And today we're going to talk about sexual compatibility because it's a topic that comes up a lot. And while I've addressed it in bits and pieces all over the blog and podcast over the years, I don't think I have a single post or podcast episode where I go through the entire argument. So that's what we're going to do today. Because the sad reality is, according to a Pew Research Center survey, 57% of Christians say that sex between unmarried adults in a committed relationship is sometimes or even always acceptable. Now, that's their beliefs. In actual practice, it actually is much less. About 80% of never married evangelical adults under 30 have had at least one sexual partner. So only about 20% of Christians are actually holding to this belief. And in society in general, it's much less. It's only about 1 to 3%. And the most common argument I hear for premarital sex is, well, you need to know if you're sexually compatible before getting married. Otherwise, you might end up stuck in a sexless, unfulfilling relationship. And that sounds like sound reasoning. We test drive cars before buying them. We have probation periods for people we hire at work. We sample foods before purchasing them. Shouldn't sex, which is one of the most intimate and important parts of marriage, be tested beforehand to make sure you're a good match? It's a compelling argument that convinces many people to abandon their principles. It makes you question your morality. It promises both immediate and long-term gratification. However, it's based on a flawed premise that sexual compatibility is something that is discovered instead of something that is built. A good spouse, including sex, isn't something that you stumble across. It is something that you create together over time through love, trust, and commitment. Your spouse is bespoke to you. They are custom made by both you and them. And this flawed premise causes a lot of strife in marriages. As a result, accepting it and either sleeping around or cohabitating before marriage statistically does more harm than good, leading to higher divorce rates, lower marital satisfaction, and intimacy that's more about performance than connection. And today we're going to dig into why that is. So why do we think sexual compatibility exists as something to be discovered? Our society tends to believe that sexuality is something that is buried deep within you, like a diamond waiting to be discovered or a volcano lying dormant, as if it's all set when you were conceived and then lies in wait waiting to be found, when in actuality we know that sexuality is built. Some of it definitely built during our formative years, but it doesn't stop there. It's constantly adapting, growing, and shifting. Some are built based on how we grew up and how our brain operates. For example, if you have parents who are both lesbian, your chance of identifying as a homosexual when you grow up increases by 150% for females and 400% for males. And I'm going to link to all the studies where all these stats come from in the show notes for those who are interested. Another example is that there is a high correlation between adults with ADHD and adults who engage in what is considered kinky behavior. Now, because ADHD is inherited and ADHD tends to express itself in the bedroom, often as kinky behavior, this leads to a shocking revelation that kink is sometimes inherited, not directly, of course, but through ADHD. So there are definitely some things that can be influenced from birth or a young age. Sexual abuse also, for obvious reasons, tends to affect people's sexuality, but that doesn't mean that we're stuck with whatever hand we're dealt. Our brains are incredibly plastic. We can adapt to an impressive array of situations and dynamics, and we do. I know men who considered themselves homosexual who managed to change their attraction and have a happy and fulfilling life married to a woman. On the other side, I have sadly talked to many sexually conservative people who are led to experiment with threesome, sex clubs, and more to the detriment of their marriage. Porn use also changes people's sexual appetites and desires, and of course, people's sex drives and interests can change drastically due to health changes, stress, hormones, and more. And all that is to say that our sexuality isn't set in stone waiting to be uncovered. It grows with us and shifts based on our context, for good or bad. But because many people believe sex is the foundation of a successful marriage, they feel compelled to test their future spouse's sexual compatibility to ensure they'll want to maintain those activities for the rest of their lives. Sex within marriage is an entirely different thing than sex before marriage. Often people see a shift in their sexuality seemingly instantaneously on occasion. Many women in particular who were highly sexual before marriage find that something just shifts overnight or even faster, sometimes between the wedding ceremony and the honeymoon. It happens so often that there's a common joke, and the joke is, what's a girlfriend's biggest turnoff? The answer is a wedding ring. Because for a lot of women, as soon as they get married, suddenly their sexual context shifts. What was taboo and exciting is now considered a duty. Should it? No, and you can work on that mindset. I have quite a few wives who are going through a course working on their mindset about sex in their marriage right now. But that doesn't change the fact that it still feels like that for many. It's not intentional and it's not a bait and switch, although it can feel like that. But it does preclude any test driving of sexual desire, drive, or adventurous, because all of that can change in the amount of time it takes to say the vows. I've talked to many women who were excitedly waiting for their wedding night to have it arrived and feel themselves shut down, leaving both them and their new husbands very confused and often hurt. Now, if you go into marriage without having had sex, this is a disappointment, but also in line with what we see on TV. I mean, we hope we picked a spouse who likes sex, but decades of TV shows have taught us that wives don't want sex, so we're at least somewhat prepared for that. If you have been having sex before the wedding with no issues with a girlfriend and then fiance who had a high sex drive, then you think you won. Then suddenly it shifts, and that's a much larger shock. And it's not only just appetite for sex in general, but also specific activities as well. Probably the most common complaint that husbands have, besides just a lack of sex drive in their spouse, is that oral sex suddenly disappears from their repertoire. That could be giving, receiving, or both. The test driving theory doesn't work because the person you marry will not be the same person you dated or were engaged to. Their context changed, and that made them change. And that doesn't mean that a married sex life is hopeless. It only means that you can't assume that you can hit the ground running. But what marriage has as its benefit is time. If you're married and you take your vows seriously, you only have two choices: suffer or get better. Because, let's face it, most of us aren't good lovers at the start. Men tend to be too excited and orgasm too quickly. We also rapidly push for new and exciting things when we haven't become proficient in our existing repertoire. Women, on the other hand, tend to be timid about exploring and speaking up about what they need and want, if they even know what they need and want, which many don't. Both spouses tend to love the fun differences between genders, but have little patience, understanding, or grace for the more challenging differences, like differing sex drives or orgasm ability. For example, the average time to orgasm for a man is under 8 minutes, whereas 70% of women don't orgasm from penetration at all, and if they do, it generally takes much longer than 8 minutes. About 14% of women under 35 have never experienced an orgasm. Many more don't until later on in their marriage. I have talked to wives who didn't even know they could orgasm until over a decade into theirs. Others knew that it was a possibility in theory, but maybe not for them. Now, of course, these are just averages and stereotypes. There are plenty of marriages where the opposite is true. These dynamics are flipped. Even the orgasm gap is flipped on its head. But over time, all these things can change. We can grow, adapt, and become better lovers of each other, both in giving and receiving. As a result, those who dedicate time and energy to becoming better lovers for each other can have fantastic sex lives into their 40s, 50s, and even later. Many have sex far more often than any 20-year-old that's hooking up on a college campus every weekend, and far better sex at that. For myself, I would say that the sex we have now, both of us being in our 40s and married over 20 years, is incomparable to the sex that we had when we were younger. It is better for both of us. It is more frequent, more adventurous, and lasts much longer. My wife says that her capacity for pleasure has grown indescribably higher in the last few years, in large part because we've been playing with edging. And if you want to know more about that, there's a resource for that in our shop. Now, I can only wish that I enjoyed as much pleasure as she does from sex. Despite me having the higher drive, she gets way more pleasure out of it, which I may be a little jealous of, but also, frankly, quite proud of. But it's not straight linear growth either. Many things can cause hiccups along the way. Women in particular tend to get a lot of speed bumps when it comes to sex. Getting married changes your mindset and context, as we already discussed. Then when many women hit their 30s, their hormones tend to shift. There's another shift in their 40s, and then around 50 again with menopause. Trying to conceive tends to shoot women's sex drives into overdrive, and then pregnancy tends to do the opposite. Now, some women have higher sex drive during some of their trimesters, but that's hit or miss. Unfortunately, this sudden shift from trying to conceive, the I want sex all the time to I'm nauseous, my back hurts, and sex just isn't appealing at all is pretty drastic, and again tends to make men feel a bit like they've been tricked. More than one husband has thought, well, they got what they wanted, a baby, and now they don't care about what I want. And this is particularly true when birthing and breastfeeding tend to lower the sex drive even further. And the biggest problem with that is that there aren't good conversations about these things. Men tend to be demonized for wanting to have sex during this season of life. When we were having babies, I remember posting saying, hey, this is a hard season for men. And the amount of hate I got of people just yelling at me, she just had a baby, back off, or don't be so selfish or whatever. I heard that over and over again. And it's a good reason not to want to have sex, but it doesn't remove the fact that, hey, we want to still feel close, and we feel close through sex. And we can handle not having sex, but handling not being able to express ourselves or share how we're feeling and being demonized for being alone, that's pretty rough to go through at the same time. Continuing on, having kids also tends to shift women's priorities towards their children and away from their husbands. Now, part of that is needed. After all, a baby will die if you don't care for it, as will a toddler, and all the way up until they're an adult. Teenagers do some stupid things. But if you still want to have a marriage when they all grow up, you had better prioritize your marriage. Too often, I see people putting their marriage on the back burner thinking, well, we'll get back to it when the kids grow up, only to find out that they don't know or like each other by that point. The we'll focus on each other when they're gone turns into staying together for the kids, which leads to the phenomena of empty nest divorces. So if you're listening to this and thinking, oh, I'll work on this when the kids are grown up and gone out of the house, don't wait. It'll be too late. On top of all this, there's work stress, family stress, church stress far too often, medical issues, relationship problems, crises of faith or life, porn, affairs, and more that can either cause blips or outright nuke your sex life for a while. We have had multiple times in our marriage where sex just didn't happen for months. Some of them were for good reasons, like a broken back. Some of them were not, like earlier on in our marriage was clinically sexless because, well, we were just both bad at being married. The point is, things go up and down. Be gracious with your spouse because whatever the reason, at least one of you thinks it's a good reason. Most spouses aren't malicious towards each other. Instead, keep loving communication open. When you shut down talking about it, when you dismiss their feelings, when you prioritize your wants and needs over theirs, or demonize them for having theirs, then you run into trouble. Don't do that. And all of this is why marriage isn't the same as dating. With dating, if anything happens, you can walk away. Ideally, you have no shared assets, no kids, and you haven't had sex yet. But a marriage should be harder to leave. There's a reason most couples share everything. Bank accounts, kids, vehicles, a house, a bed, and everything else. Everything we do that intertwines our lives makes it harder for us to just up and leave. Now, some don't like that. More and more couples choose to keep their finances separate. They sleep in separate beds or even separate rooms. Some go on vacation separately. There's even a growing idea that marriages should be time-bound with a renewable contract that could exit at some standardized interval. This idea was popularized by the book Brave New World quite a long time ago. Sadly, many seem to have missed the point that it was a symptom of a society in which Marxism had succeeded in its goal of destroying the idea of family and lauded the idea of transient relationships, which is precisely what is promoted in our society today and is slowly edging into Christianity as well. Those who think that way have missed the entire point. Marriage is not supposed to be escapable. It is not supposed to be a separation like that. It is the inescapability that makes it completely different from any other relationship. It's why you can't test drive a marriage. It's an entirely different experience than having a girlfriend, boyfriend, or fiance. And the stats bear this out. Test driving doesn't work. Living together before being engaged increases your divorce risk by 50 to 80% depending on the study. That's the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish, finding a good spouse. You're more likely to lose them. The risk of divorce drops in the first year because it's less of a transition, but then increases after that. It also lowers marital satisfaction, dedication, and confidence. So not only are you likely to lose them, but they won't be as happy if you manage to keep them. The likelihood of negative communication patterns increases as well, and everyone has these, but why would you want more of them? It also leads to higher rates of domestic violence. And the longer you cohabitate before marriage, the worse these stats get. If you live together when you're dating, you'll be worse off than if you live together when you're engaged, which is worse than if you live together first when you're married. And lastly, it slows down the relationship. The old adage, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free, has truth to it. If you are looking for a spouse, living together will slow that process down. So when someone tells you to make sure you're sexually compatible, the question is, what are you willing to risk for all that? Apparently, health, safety, happiness, and ultimately your marriage, all to test something that cannot be tested. You're not supposed to be able to test drive it. It's a leap of faith in many ways. We are supposed to marry someone who is not perfect for us. That's how we grow. That's how they grow as well. Because our spouse was not created for us. God doesn't have the perfect person in mind. There are no soulmates. If you want to look for the origin of the soulmate story, you have to read Plato's Symposium. It's not biblical and it's not reality. God doesn't pick our spouse. He doesn't create them just for us. They become bespoke to us as we are in a relationship with them and we to them. And ultimately, the idea of being able to test the relationship focuses on the wrong thing anyways. It is all about selfishness, about getting what you want and being sure you will keep getting what you want in the long term. It doesn't work, but that's the goal. And as I said in my last podcast episode, it is not a mindset that makes for a good marriage in the long term. So if you go into the marriage with the idea of, oh, I'm going to make sure I get what I want, then you're intentionally starting out with the wrong mindset. Most people have that mindset, but it's not overt. It's not chosen. It's just the way that we are when we're young and immature. You know, we think that we're being loving, but the sexual compatibility argument explicitly goes the other way. It is all about serving me. So if you have this mindset, you will enter the marriage with the idea that if it changes, if I'm ever not satisfied with them, then I'm out because that's what's important. That's priority number one. And so it's no wonder that it doesn't work. Even the idea of testing it causes damage to the relationship. This is not what a marriage was designed to be. It also misses the point of sex. Sex is about serving each other, not serving yourself. And that's when it gets really good. Marriage and sex are about loving sacrificially, and you can't test someone else for something that needs to be cultivated in you. So, no, I don't think you can test for sexual compatibility. Right off the bat, it sets you up for failure because the mindset is all wrong. And then it just goes downhill from there because the person you're testing is not the person you'll marry, let alone the person they will be in 5, 10, 20, 30, or more years later. You can't test for real love and sexual compatibility long term. You create it, you nurture it, and you consciously reinvent it through your shared journey. Now, if you have more thoughts on this, if you have an angle that I didn't tackle, if you have more questions, you are more than welcome to email me or head over to the blog and post something in the comment section. I would love to get more discussion, because discussion is something that we are sorely missing in Christianity, especially around the topics of marriage and sex. I look forward to hearing from you, and if not, I will talk to you next time.